Pay attention to this surveillance footage recovered from a meat processing facility in Portland, Oregon. You're watching a worker in a blue lab coat standing next to what appears to be an enormous animal carcass on a stainless steel table. Look at the size of that creature. It's massive, bloated, unnatural. Notice the industrial meat grinder in the background, the sterile laboratory setting, and the pile of processed tissue spreading across the table. This isn't a standard slaughterhouse. This is a secret laboratory where a disgraced scientist spent 2 years breeding genetically modified rats to the size of livestock, then selling their meat to restaurants across 3 states. What you're looking at is evidence from one of the most disturbing food contamination cases in American history, a case that killed 17 people and sickened hundreds more before authorities finally discovered the truth. In the next 2 hours, you're going to hear how one man's obsession with revolutionizing the food industry turned into a nightmare of biological experimentation, corporate fraud, and mass poisoning. You know that feeling when you bite into a meal at a restaurant and something tastes just slightly off? Not bad enough to send it back, but different enough to make you pause for a second? For hundreds of people across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California between 2002 and 2004, that strange taste was the first warning sign of something far more sinister than a bad batch of meat. Dr. Raymond Fletcher didn't start out as a monster. At least, that's what everyone who knew him in his early career would tell you. He was a brilliant veterinary scientist, specializing in agricultural genetics and animal husbandry. He'd earned his doctorate from UC Davis in 1989, published dozens of papers on sustainable protein sources and livestock optimization, and by the late 1990s, he was considered one of the leading voices in the field of agricultural biotechnology. But brilliance and ethics don't always go hand in hand, and for Raymond Fletcher, the line between revolutionary science and dangerous obsession blurred somewhere around 1998. When he started asking questions that made his colleagues deeply uncomfortable. Questions like, why do we limit ourselves to traditional livestock? And what if we could create entirely new protein sources through genetic modification? And most disturbingly, how large could we make rodents before their biology became unstable? By 2001, Raymond was working as a senior researcher at Portland State University's Agricultural Sciences Department. He had his own lab, his own research budget, and enough autonomy to pursue increasingly controversial experiments. His official research was focused on growth hormones in poultry, but his colleagues started noticing something strange. Raymond was ordering massive quantities of rats for his lab, far more than any legitimate research would require. Dr. Linda Morrison, who worked in the lab next to Raymond's, remembered those days with a shudder. He became secretive, she told investigators later. He'd lock his lab even when he was inside, covered the windows with black paper, and refused to discuss his research at department meetings. The smell coming from his lab was terrible, like ammonia and decay mixed together. We complained to the department head multiple times, but Raymond always had explanations. He was working with sensitive specimens, he said. Temperature-controlled experiments that couldn't be disturbed. What nobody knew at the time was that Raymond had gone completely rogue. Behind those blacked-out windows, he was conducting experiments that violated every ethical guideline in scientific research. He was injecting rats with cocktails of growth hormones, genetic modifiers, and experimental drugs, trying to create animals that could grow to unprecedented sizes while maintaining enough tissue quality to be harvested for meat. His logic, as twisted as it was, had a certain internal consistency. Rats reproduce quickly, eat almost anything, thrive in confined spaces, and convert feed to body mass efficiently. If you could make them large enough, say the size of a pig or sheep, you could theoretically create a revolutionary protein source that required minimal space and resources. He genuinely believed he was solving world hunger. He told himself he was a visionary, working on research that was too radical for the establishment to understand. But in March 2002, everything came crashing down. A graduate student working late one night heard screaming coming from Raymond's lab. Not human screaming, but the high-pitched shrieks of animals in distress. She called campus security, who forced their way into the lab and found a nightmare. Cages stacked floor to ceiling, filled with rats that had been grotesquely enlarged through Raymond's experiments. Some were the size of house cats, others even bigger, their bodies bloated and deformed, many of them suffering from tumors, organ failure, and obvious pain. The conditions were horrific: feces and urine everywhere, inadequate ventilation, rats cannibalizing each other in their overcrowded cages. Raymond was fired immediately. The university launched an investigation, contacted animal welfare authorities, and euthanized all the experimental animals. Raymond's research licenses were revoked, and he was banned from conducting any further animal research. The story made local news for a few days. Mad scientist tortured rats at PSU, and then faded from public consciousness. Everyone assumed that was the end of Raymond Fletcher's career. They were wrong. What happened next, investigators would later piece together from Raymond's meticulous records, was a descent into criminal obsession disguised as entrepreneurship. After losing his university position, Raymond should have been finished. No legitimate research institution would hire him. His reputation was destroyed. His wife left him, taking their 2 children. He was facing bankruptcy, with massive legal bills from the university's lawsuit and no income to pay them. But Raymond wasn't done with his experiments. If anything, losing his position freed him from the last remaining ethical constraints. He didn't need university oversight anymore. He didn't need ethics committees or peer review. He could pursue his vision without anyone interfering. Using the last of his savings and a loan from his elderly mother, Raymond purchased a defunct meat processing facility on the outskirts of Portland in June 2002. The building had previously been used for specialty game processing, deer, elk, exotic meats, and still had all the necessary equipment: industrial freezers, meat grinders, vacuum sealers, everything needed for a legitimate operation. But Raymond wasn't planning to process game animals. He was going to restart his rat experiments, and this time, he was going to make them profitable. The facility was perfect for his purposes. It was isolated, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings in an industrial area that had been declining for years. The nearest occupied business was a quarter-mile away. Nobody would hear anything. Nobody would see anything. Raymond could work in complete secrecy. He started small, ordering breeding pairs of rats from various suppliers to avoid suspicion. He set up his laboratory in the basement, rows of large cages with sophisticated feeding systems, temperature controls, and monitoring equipment. Upstairs, he maintained the meat processing area, keeping it spotlessly clean and professional-looking in case anyone ever inspected the facility. Raymond had learned from his mistakes at the university. This time, he'd be more careful with his growth protocols. He'd start with lower doses of hormones, gradually increase them, monitor the animal's health more closely. He'd breed for size, but also for vitality, trying to create rats that could reach enormous proportions while maintaining healthy organs and usable tissue. It took him 6 months of trial and error, but by January 2003, Raymond had succeeded in creating what he considered viable specimens. Using a combination of growth hormones, selective breeding, and careful nutrition management, he'd produced rats that weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, roughly the size of medium dogs. They weren't pretty, bloated, with patchy fur and slightly distorted proportions, but they were alive, and more importantly, they had massive amounts of harvestable meat. Raymond's business plan was simple. He'd process the rat meat in his facility, package it professionally, and sell it as exotic game to budget restaurants and small distributors. He'd forge inspection certificates, create fake documentation about the meat's origin, and price it low enough that buyers wouldn't ask too many questions. Restaurants always needed cheap protein sources, especially in the competitive Portland food scene where margins were razor thin. His first harvest produced 87 pounds of processed meat from 2 of his experimental rats. He packaged it in vacuum-sealed bags labeled Wild Boar, Premium Game Meat, with a fake USDA inspection stamp he'd created using Photoshop and a decent printer. He even gave his operation a name: Pacific Northwest Game Suppliers. The first sale was to a small family-owned restaurant in southeast Portland called The Hungry Bear. The owner, Anthony Delgado, was immediately interested. Raymond's prices were 40% below market rate for wild boar. He seemed legitimate, Anthony would later tell investigators, his voice hollow with guilt. He had all the paperwork, professional packaging, a business card. The meat looked fine. It smelled fine. How were we supposed to know? That first batch caused no immediate problems. The meat was prepared, served to customers, and nobody reported any issues. Raymond was elated. His system worked. Now he just needed to scale up. Over the next 6 months, Raymond expanded his operation dramatically. He invested in more breeding stock, built additional cage systems in the basement, and increased his production capacity. By July 2003, he was harvesting and processing 3 to 4 rats per week, producing over 600 pounds of meat per month. He cultivated relationships with small restaurants, ethnic food markets, and discount distributors across Oregon and Washington. He always targeted businesses that were struggling financially, that couldn't afford premium suppliers, that wouldn't look too closely at documentation as long as the price was right. He developed a reputation as a reliable source of exotic meats at unbeatable prices. But there were problems brewing beneath the surface. Raymond's breeding program was inherently unstable. The growth hormones and genetic modifications that allowed the rats to reach such enormous sizes also caused serious health issues. The animals developed tumors, liver disease, kidney problems, and hormonal imbalances. Their meat was saturated with the chemicals Raymond had used to modify them, plus whatever toxins their diseased organs couldn't filter out. Raymond knew this. His background was in veterinary science. He understood pathology and toxicology. He knew his products were potentially dangerous for human consumption, but he rationalized it away. The meat was cooked at high temperatures, which he told himself would kill any pathogens. The toxin levels were probably low enough to be safe in small doses. Besides, he was providing an affordable protein source. He was helping struggling restaurants stay in business. He was doing more good than harm. That's what he told himself anyway, as he watched his bank account finally start to recover. By October 2003, Raymond had distributed meat to over 30 different businesses across 3 states. He'd processed over 3,500 pounds of rat meat, generating revenue of approximately $87,000. Not enough to make him wealthy, but enough to pay his bills and fund further expansion of his operation. The first death occurred on October 23, 2003. Dorothy Hamilton was a 67-year-old retired teacher from Beaverton, Oregon. She and her husband went to the Hungry Bear for their anniversary dinner, where she ordered the restaurant's wild boar special, slow-roasted meat with root vegetables and herbs. It was delicious, she told the server. Best meal she'd had in years. 3 days later, Dorothy was dead. She'd developed what initially appeared to be food poisoning, severe vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. But her condition deteriorated rapidly. Her kidneys failed. Her liver began shutting down. By the time her family got her to the hospital, multiple organ systems were in crisis. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. It wasn't a typical bacterial infection, wasn't a viral illness, wasn't anything they'd seen before. Dorothy died on October 26th with her family around her, still confused about what had killed her. The initial death certificate listed the cause as acute organ failure, unknown etiology. An autopsy was performed, but the pathologist couldn't identify a specific cause of death beyond the obvious organ damage. Her husband, Walter Hamilton, was grief-stricken, but didn't immediately suspect the restaurant. His wife had been elderly, had some underlying health issues. Sometimes these things just happened, the doctors told him. Sometimes people died suddenly, and medicine couldn't explain why. If Dorothy had been the only case, it might have ended there. But she wasn't. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 more people died in Oregon and Washington under similar circumstances. All elderly or immunocompromised individuals, all developing rapid organ failure after initially appearing to have food poisoning, all having eaten at restaurants that sourced meat from Pacific Northwest game suppliers. The Oregon Health Authority started noticing a pattern. 5 unexplained deaths in 3 weeks, all with similar presentation, all in the Portland metro area. They began investigating potential environmental contaminants, water supply issues, anything that might explain the cluster. Meanwhile, Raymond Fletcher watched the news coverage and felt the first stirrings of panic. He'd been monitoring reports of illness complaints from some of his client restaurants, customers getting sick after eating game meat dishes. He'd dismissed them as isolated incidents, typical food handling issues that had nothing to do with his products. But 5 deaths? That was different. That would trigger a serious investigation. He considered shutting down his operation, destroying the evidence, and disappearing. But he'd already committed too much. He had over $40,000 worth of processed meat in his freezers, ready to ship. He had standing orders from restaurants expecting deliveries. Walking away meant financial ruin and probably criminal investigation anyway. So Raymond made a decision that would seal his fate. He kept operating. He convinced himself that the deaths weren't actually related to his meat, that it was just an unfortunate coincidence, that if he stopped now, he'd be destroying his business for no reason. The 6th death came in early November. Brandon Martinez, a 34-year-old software developer from Seattle, ate dinner at a small Asian fusion restaurant that had purchased Raymond's wild boar for their special menu items. Brandon was young, healthy, athletic, the kind of person who should have survived food poisoning easily. He died in 4 days. This death finally triggered alarm bells at the CDC. A healthy young person developing acute multi-organ failure after eating at a restaurant couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The CDC dispatched an epidemic intelligence service team to investigate the outbreak. Dr. Victoria Santos led the investigation. She started by interviewing the families of all 6 victims, trying to find common exposures. The pattern emerged quickly. 5 of the 6 had eaten game meat dishes at different restaurants in the days before they became ill. The 6th victim, when his credit card records were checked, had also eaten at a game meat restaurant during the probable exposure window. "We knew we were looking at contaminated meat," Dr. Santos explained later. But what kind of contamination causes this specific pattern of organ failure? It wasn't bacterial. The illness progression was wrong. It wasn't parasitic. No evidence in tissue samples. The toxicology was showing something strange, elevated levels of growth hormones and other compounds we couldn't initially identify. The CDC contacted all 7 restaurants that the victims had eaten at and requested their supplier information. 6 of the 7 restaurants had sourced game meat from the same distributor, Pacific Northwest Game Suppliers, operated by Dr. Raymond Fletcher. On November 18, 2003, FDA investigators, accompanied by local police, showed up at Raymond's facility with a warrant to inspect his operation and seize samples of his products. What they found inside would shock even seasoned investigators who'd seen decades of food safety violations. FDA Inspector Carlos Reyes had been investigating food safety violations for 15 years. He'd seen commercial kitchens with roaches and rats, seen meat stored at dangerous temperatures, seen every kind of negligence and corner cutting you could imagine. But when he entered Raymond Fletcher's facility on that November morning, he realized he was looking at something entirely different. The main floor looked professional, Reyes later testified. Clean equipment, proper refrigeration, organized storage. If we'd only inspected the processing area, we might not have caught anything immediately suspicious. But then we asked to see his source animals, his slaughter area, his breeding records. That's when everything changed. Raymond tried to refuse access to the basement. He claimed it was a storage area, that there was nothing relevant to the investigation down there. But the warrant was comprehensive, and the investigators insisted. With a sheriff's deputy standing beside him, Raymond had no choice but to unlock the basement door. The smell hit them first, that thick, ammonia-heavy stench of too many animals in too small a space, combined with the copper tang of blood and the sickly sweet smell of decay. Inspector Reyes covered his nose and mouth as he descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the dim lighting. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Reyes said during the trial, his voice still shaken by the memory. I've seen bad conditions before, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what was in that basement. The basement was enormous, taking up the entire footprint of the building, and every inch of it was filled with cages. Hundreds of them, stacked in rows, each one containing rats that had been genetically modified and hormonally enhanced to grotesque proportions. Some were the size of large cats, weighing maybe 20 or 25 pounds, but others, the ones Raymond considered his premium stock, were massive. The largest rat in the facility weighed 73 pounds, according to Raymond's records. It was kept in a cage by itself, a bloated, tumor-ridden creature that could barely move under its own weight. They looked like something out of a horror movie, Reyes testified. The proportions were all wrong. Bodies too large for their legs, heads that seemed small compared to their swollen torsos. Many of them had visible tumors, patches of missing fur, signs of infection. And the noise. Hundreds of rats squealing and scratching, the sound echoed off the concrete walls. It was overwhelming. But the cages were just the beginning. In the back corner of the basement was Raymond's processing area, a makeshift slaughterhouse where he butchered his experimental animals. Stainless steel tables, industrial drains, hanging chains, knives and saws. The floor was stained with old blood, and despite Raymond's efforts to keep it clean, the forensic team would later find biological material everywhere. Inspector Reyes immediately called for backup. More FDA investigators, animal control officers, and detectives from the Portland Police Department. This wasn't just a food safety violation anymore. This was animal cruelty on an industrial scale, coupled with what was looking more and more like mass poisoning. Raymond was read his Miranda rights and placed under arrest. As officers began documenting the scene, Raymond asked if he could make a statement. What he said next would become crucial evidence in his trial. "I want you to understand something," Raymond said, sitting in the back of a police car while crime scene investigators swarmed his facility. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to solve a problem. The world needs sustainable protein sources. Traditional livestock is inefficient, terrible for the environment. My rats converted feed to body mass at twice the rate of pigs or cattle. I was creating the future of food production." "You were feeding people rat meat," Detective Patricia Wong said flatly. "Rat meat contaminated with God knows what chemicals and pathogens." "It was processed correctly," Raymond insisted. "Cooked thoroughly. The restaurants prepared it properly. Any health issues were probably due to improper handling at their end, not my product." "6 people are dead, Dr. Fletcher, and we're finding more sick every day. This isn't improper handling. This is poisoning." Raymond's face went pale. 6? I didn't think... The dosages were supposed to be safe. I calculated everything. The hormone levels, the chemical compounds, everything should have been within acceptable ranges once the meat was cooked. "Acceptable ranges for what?" Wong demanded. "There are no acceptable ranges for serving genetically modified rat meat to unsuspecting customers. This isn't legal food. These aren't approved animals for consumption." That's when Raymond seemed to fully grasp what he'd done. He put his head in his hands and started crying. Meanwhile, the investigation was expanding rapidly. The FDA obtained Raymond's customer list. 43 different restaurants, markets, and distributors across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Every single one received urgent notices to cease using any products from Pacific Northwest game suppliers immediately and to cooperate with the investigation. The media got wind of the story within hours. "Secret rat farm supplied restaurants with contaminated meat," ran the headline in the Oregonian. The story went national by evening. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC all covered it. The Portland Health Department's tip line was overwhelmed with calls from panicked residents who'd eaten at restaurants that might have served Raymond's meat. Dr. Victoria Santos and her CDC team worked around the clock to identify everyone who might have been exposed. They compiled lists of customers from credit card records, interviewed restaurant staff about their menu items and preparation methods, and tried to estimate how many people had consumed the contaminated meat. The numbers were staggering. Over 3,500 pounds of rat meat had been distributed over 16 months. Assuming average portion sizes, that meant potentially over 7,000 individual servings had been consumed. Most people had probably suffered no ill effects, maybe some mild digestive issues they dismissed as typical food poisoning. But for those with compromised immune systems, underlying health conditions, or who'd simply received portions with higher concentrations of toxins, the results were devastating. By November 25, 2003, 1 week after Raymond's arrest, the death toll had risen to 11. The Oregon Health Authority had identified 127 confirmed cases of illness requiring hospitalization, and hundreds more reports of people who'd been sick but hadn't sought medical treatment. Toxicology reports on Raymond's meat samples revealed a cocktail of contaminants that horrified food safety experts. Growth hormones at levels 50 times higher than what would be found in normal meat. Residues from experimental drugs that had never been approved for use in food animals. Heavy metals and other toxins concentrated in the organs and tissues, and because Raymond's rats were often sick or dying from their genetic modifications, many of them had active infections or septic conditions at the time of slaughter. This meat was fundamentally unsafe for human consumption, Dr. Santos testified at trial. Not in the way that spoiled meat or contaminated meat is unsafe. This was biologically toxic at a molecular level. The animals were so heavily dosed with growth hormones and experimental compounds that their tissues were essentially poisoned. Cooking it didn't help because the contaminants weren't pathogens that could be killed by heat. They were chemical compounds that remained stable through cooking. The animal cruelty aspect of the case was equally damning. Veterinarians who examined the surviving rats from Raymond's facility found conditions that violated every standard of humane animal treatment. Severe overcrowding, inadequate food and water, no veterinary care despite obvious illnesses and injuries. Many of the rats had tumors so large they couldn't move properly. Some had infections that had gone untreated for weeks or months. Several were found dead in their cages, having been partially cannibalized by their cage mates. Dr. Catherine Brennan, the veterinarian who oversaw the rescue and euthanization of the animals, struggled to maintain her composure during her testimony. "I've worked in animal welfare for 20 years, she said. I've seen puppy mills, hoarding situations, neglect cases, but I've never seen suffering on this scale. These animals were created specifically to be exploited, and they lived their entire lives in pain and misery. The kindest thing we could do was end their suffering." All 847 rats from Raymond's facility were humanely euthanized. The building was declared a biohazard and sealed pending decontamination. The investigation into Raymond's background revealed how he'd spiraled from respected researcher to criminal. Financial records showed he'd been on the brink of bankruptcy after losing his university position. His ex-wife testified about his increasing obsession with his research, his inability to accept that his experiments were unethical, his conviction that he was a misunderstood genius who would eventually be vindicated. He genuinely believed he was helping humanity, she testified, her voice sad rather than angry. He thought traditional scientists were too conservative, too bound by outdated ethical considerations. He used to say that progress required someone willing to take risks, to push boundaries. I tried to tell him there was a difference between pushing boundaries and breaking laws, but he couldn't see it. Raymond's research notes, recovered from his office, provided a disturbing window into his thought process. He'd kept detailed journals documenting his experiments, including his rationale for continuing despite obvious problems. One entry from August 2003 read, "Specimen 47 showing signs of liver distress, may need to adjust hormone protocol. However, meat yield is excellent, 67 pounds of usable tissue. If I can maintain this size while improving organ health, production will be optimal." Another, from October 2003, after the first deaths had been reported, news coverage of unexplained illnesses in metro area. Unlikely to be related to product, more probable explanation is restaurant handling or customer pre-existing conditions. Will continue monitoring situation. Even after knowing his meat had made people sick, Raymond had convinced himself it wasn't his fault. It was this psychological profile, a brilliant scientist who'd lost all ethical grounding, who'd rationalized his way into criminal behavior while maintaining a self-image as a visionary, that made the case so disturbing to everyone involved. As winter turned to 2004, the death toll continued to climb. Some victims had consumed Raymond's meat months earlier and were only now showing symptoms as their organ damage became critical. Others had survived the initial illness but were left with permanent kidney or liver damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The final death count reached 17 by March 2004. The youngest victim was 28 years old, the oldest was 81. They came from all walks of life: teachers, software developers, construction workers, retirees. What they had in common was that they'd all eaten at restaurants trying to save money by buying suspiciously cheap meat from a supplier who asked no questions and provided no legitimate documentation. The restaurant owners faced their own reckoning. Many of them went out of business, either forced to close by health department orders or destroyed by the publicity. Some faced criminal charges for failing to verify their supplier's credentials, though most of those charges were eventually dropped since they'd genuinely been deceived by Raymond's forged documents. Anthony Delgado, owner of the Hungry Bear where the first victim had eaten, was devastated. "I trusted him," Delgado said in a tearful interview with local news. "He had professional packaging, business cards, inspection certificates. How was I supposed to know it was all fake? Now people are dead because I was trying to keep my restaurant afloat by cutting costs. I'll never forgive myself." The FDA launched a comprehensive review of its oversight procedures, trying to understand how Raymond had operated for 16 months without detection. The answer was uncomfortable. The food safety system relied heavily on voluntary compliance and self-reporting. A determined fraud who was willing to forge documents and lie consistently could slip through the cracks, especially when targeting small operations that fell below the radar of regular inspections. Raymond Fletcher's trial began in September 2004, nearly 10 months after his arrest. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Christopher Bennett, who faced the challenge of bringing charges that reflected the unprecedented nature of Raymond's crimes. The indictment included 17 counts of negligent homicide, one for each person who died from consuming his contaminated meat, federal food safety violations, fraud for the forged inspection documents, animal cruelty charges under Oregon state law, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud for his systematic deception of restaurants and distributors. Raymond's defense attorney, Jonathan Pierce, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming: hundreds of pounds of contaminated meat, documented deaths directly linked to that meat, Raymond's own journals showing he knew his products were potentially dangerous, and testimony from dozens of victims and their families. Pierce tried to argue diminished capacity, that Raymond's obsession with his research had created a kind of psychological break that prevented him from understanding the consequences of his actions. He brought in psychiatrists who testified that Raymond exhibited signs of narcissistic personality disorder and showed an inability to empathize with his victims. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They showed that Raymond had been methodical and calculating in every aspect of his operation. He'd researched how to forge USDA documents. He'd deliberately targeted struggling restaurants that wouldn't scrutinize his credentials too closely. He'd kept his operation hidden and lied consistently when questioned. This wasn't someone who couldn't understand right from wrong. This was someone who understood perfectly well and chose wrong anyway. The key piece of evidence was the surveillance footage from Raymond's own facility. He'd installed security cameras throughout the building, including in the basement laboratory and the meat processing area. The footage showed him butchering his experimental rats with cold efficiency, packaging the meat, labeling it as wild boar or exotic game, and preparing it for distribution. But the most damning footage came from a camera Raymond had positioned in his office, apparently to document his work for his personal records. In these videos, Raymond spoke directly to the camera, explaining his process, his business model, and his philosophy. In one video, dated July 2003, Raymond stood in front of shelves stocked with packaged meat and said, "This is the future of sustainable protein production. Traditional livestock farming is destroying the planet. My rats require minimal space, eat food waste, reproduce rapidly, and convert nutrients to body mass more efficiently than any conventional farm animal. Yes, there are some regulatory challenges, but that's only because the system is designed to protect established industries, not to encourage innovation. In 20 years, everyone will understand what I've accomplished here." The prosecution played this video for the jury, then immediately followed it with hospital footage of victims dying from organ failure, testimony from their grieving families, and medical evidence showing exactly what Raymond's innovation had done to human beings who'd consumed his products. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury heard from over 60 witnesses, victims, family members, medical experts, FDA investigators, veterinarians, and Raymond's former colleagues who testified about his descent from legitimate researcher to criminal. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Diane Martinez, whose son Brandon had been the 6th victim. Brandon was the healthy 34-year-old software developer whose death had finally triggered the full CDC investigation. "My son was a good person," Diane said from the witness stand, her voice trembling but strong. "He volunteered at food banks. He mentored kids in his neighborhood. He had his whole life ahead of him. He went out to dinner at a restaurant he trusted, and 4 days later he was dead. Not from an accident or a disease, from eating food that a scientist deliberately contaminated with experimental poisons and then sold for profit. Raymond Fletcher didn't just kill my son. He robbed the world of all the good Brandon would have done, all the lives he would have touched. And for what? So Raymond could make some money and feel like a genius?" The defense's closing argument tried to paint Raymond as a tragic figure, a brilliant mind corrupted by financial desperation and an obsessive belief in his own vision. "Raymond Fletcher isn't a murderer," Pierce told the jury. "He's a scientist who made terrible decisions, who let his ambition override his judgment. He didn't set out to kill anyone. He genuinely believed he was creating something beneficial." But A.D.A. Bennett's closing demolished this narrative, standing in front of projected images of the victims, school photos, wedding pictures, family snapshots. He addressed the jury with controlled fury. "The defense wants you to see Raymond Fletcher as a misunderstood scientist, a tragic figure, but let's look at what he actually did. He took rats, animals that any reasonable person knows are not approved for human consumption, and he modified them with experimental chemicals and hormones that he knew caused organ disease and tumors. He butchered these sick, toxic animals in a basement laboratory. He forged federal inspection documents. He deliberately deceived restaurants and distributors about what he was selling them. And when people started dying, he didn't stop. He didn't turn himself in. He didn't warn anyone. He kept selling contaminated meat because his business was more important than human lives." Bennett gestured to the photos behind him. "These aren't abstract casualties of scientific progress. They're real people. Dorothy Hamilton, who loved gardening and volunteered at her church. Brandon Martinez, who was planning to propose to his girlfriend next month. William Chen, a grandfather who'd just retired and was looking forward to traveling with his wife. 17 real people with families who loved them, futures that were stolen from them, and Raymond Fletcher is responsible for every single death." The jury deliberated for 3 days. On October 18, 2004, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Raymond showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His ex-wife, sitting in the back of the courtroom, quietly cried. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later, in December 2004. Before Judge Helen Roberts imposed sentence, she allowed victim impact statements from family members. One by one, they came forward: spouses, children, parents, siblings of the 17 people who died. They talked about birthday celebrations that would never happen, grandchildren who'd never meet their grandparents, careers cut short, dreams unfulfilled. They talked about the trauma of watching their loved ones die in agony, not understanding what was happening until it was too late. Walter Hamilton, whose wife Dorothy had been the first victim, was the last to speak. He was 70 years old, hunched with grief, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife and I were married for 47 years, he said. We raised 3 children together. We survived cancer, job losses, the death of our parents. We thought we'd grow old together, maybe get a few more years to enjoy retirement. Instead, I watched her die in a hospital bed, her organs shutting down one by one while doctors couldn't figure out what was killing her. The last thing she said to me was, 'I'm scared,' and I couldn't do anything to help her." He looked directly at Raymond. "You did this. You chose profit over people's lives. You chose your ego over basic human decency. And now I'm alone for the rest of my life because you wanted to play God with animals and didn't care who got hurt." Judge Roberts listened to every statement. Then she turned to Raymond. "Mr. Fletcher, you have been convicted of some of the most disturbing crimes I've encountered in my 25 years on the bench. You took your scientific knowledge and perverted it into a scheme that prioritized profit over human life. You experimented on animals with grotesque cruelty. You deceived honest business owners. You poisoned innocent people. And even when confronted with evidence that your products were killing people, you continued operating because your vision was more important than their lives." She paused, looking at the sentencing guidelines in front of her. "The federal sentencing guidelines for your crimes suggest a range of 30 to 40 years. But those guidelines were not written with someone like you in mind. This court has the authority to depart upward from those guidelines when justice requires it, and in this case, justice demands recognition of the extraordinary harm you've caused. 17 counts of negligent homicide, 5 years on each count, to run consecutively, 85 years total. Federal food safety violations, 23 counts, 2 years on each count, to run concurrently with homicide sentences. Wire fraud and conspiracy, 10 years, to run concurrently with other sentences. Forgery of federal documents, 5 years, to run concurrently with other sentences. Animal cruelty, 847 counts under Oregon law. Maximum sentence of 5 years, to run concurrently with federal sentences. You will serve 85 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, Judge Roberts concluded. Given your age and the length of this sentence, you will almost certainly spend the rest of your life incarcerated. That is appropriate. You ended 17 lives and destroyed countless others. You do not deserve to walk free again." Raymond was 54 years old at sentencing. He would be 139 before becoming eligible for release, a mathematical impossibility that effectively meant life in prison. The aftermath of the rat farm conspiracy, as it came to be known, rippled through multiple industries and led to significant reforms in food safety regulation. The FDA implemented sweeping changes to its oversight procedures. New regulations required more frequent inspections of small-scale meat processors, better verification of supplier credentials, and increased criminal penalties for food safety fraud. The agency also created a task force specifically focused on identifying and investigating suspicious suppliers who targeted vulnerable businesses with unusually cheap products. Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act in 2006, partially in response to Raymond's case. The law gave the FDA greater authority to recall contaminated products, increased funding for inspections, and created mandatory testing protocols for all meat sold for human consumption. The legislation also established a national database where restaurants and distributors could verify supplier credentials and inspection records in real time, a system designed to prevent another Raymond Fletcher from operating undetected. The database, officially named the National Food Supplier Verification System, went live in January 2007. It required all meat processors to register with the FDA and maintain current inspection records that could be accessed by any potential buyer. Restaurant associations across the country promoted the system heavily, encouraging their members to use it for every supplier relationship. Within 2 years, compliance was nearly universal, and several attempted food fraud operations were shut down before they could distribute contaminated products. One such case involved a meat distributor in Nevada who'd been planning a similar scheme with genetically modified rabbits. The distributor had already purchased equipment and begun preliminary experiments when the new database requirements forced him to either register legitimately or abandon his plans. When he attempted to register with forged credentials, the system's verification protocols immediately flagged his application and alerted authorities. He was arrested before a single pound of contaminated meat reached consumers, a direct result of the reforms Raymond's case had inspired. The 17 families who'd lost loved ones filed a massive civil lawsuit against Raymond, though there were virtually no assets to collect. His facility had been seized and destroyed, and he had no significant savings or property. They eventually received a settlement from the insurance companies that had covered some of the restaurants, though no amount of money could compensate for their losses. The settlement totaled $8.7 million, distributed among the families based on the economic impact of each death and the suffering endured. Several of the restaurants that had purchased Raymond's meat went out of business, unable to recover from the publicity and the loss of customer trust. Anthony Delgado, owner of the Hungry Bear, closed his restaurant permanently in January 2005. He later became an advocate for stricter supplier verification requirements, traveling to restaurant industry conferences to share his story and warn others about the dangers of cutting corners on food sourcing. "I thought I was being a smart businessman by finding a cheap supplier," Delgado told a conference audience in 2007. "Instead, I became part of a chain that killed people. Every restaurant owner needs to understand. If a price seems too good to be true, it probably is. Ask questions. Verify credentials. Visit your supplier's facility if possible. Your customers' lives depend on it." Delgado also worked with the National Restaurant Association to develop training programs specifically focused on supplier verification and food safety due diligence. These programs became part of standard manager certification courses and reached thousands of food service professionals across the country. His personal story, delivered with raw emotion and genuine remorse, became one of the most effective teaching tools in the industry. By 2010, his training program had been adopted by restaurant chains nationwide, and food safety violations related to supplier fraud had decreased by 37%. The scientific community grappled with how one of their own had gone so far astray. Portland State University conducted a comprehensive review of their oversight procedures and implemented new safeguards to prevent researchers from conducting unauthorized experiments. The incident sparked broader discussions about the pressures on scientists to produce results, the ethics of animal research, and the importance of institutional oversight. Dr. Linda Morrison, who'd worked in the lab next to Raymond's at PSU, became a leading voice in research ethics. "We can't just assume that intelligent people will make ethical decisions," she said in a 2008 interview. "The case of Raymond Fletcher shows us that brilliance without moral grounding can lead to horror. We need stronger oversight, better training in research ethics, and most importantly, we need to create environments where people feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation." Morrison went on to establish the Center for Ethical Research Practices at PSU, funded partially by grants and partially by donations from people affected by Raymond's crimes. The center provides training for researchers, maintains an anonymous hotline for reporting ethical concerns, and conducts regular audits of research protocols across the university. Other institutions across the country adopted similar programs, citing the Raymond Fletcher case as proof that ethical oversight couldn't be treated as an afterthought. The center's influence extended beyond PSU. By 2012, over 150 universities nationwide had established similar ethical oversight programs, and the federal government had incorporated many of the center's recommendations into updated research guidelines. The anonymous reporting system alone had prevented an estimated 47 potentially dangerous or unethical experiments from proceeding, according to a 2015 review of the program's effectiveness. The survivors of Raymond's poisoning faced long-term health consequences. Many required ongoing treatment for kidney or liver damage. Several needed organ transplants. The youngest survivor, a 28-year-old woman named Nicole Anderson, spent 2 years on dialysis before receiving a kidney transplant. She later became an advocate for organ donation, turning her experience into a mission to help others. Raymond Fletcher tried to destroy my life, Nicole said at a victim advocacy conference in 2009. But I refused to let him. Yes, I have scars. Yes, I have medical issues I'll deal with forever. But I'm alive, and I'm going to make that life count. Every day I get is a day he didn't take from me. Nicole's advocacy work focused specifically on supporting victims of food contamination cases, a surprisingly underserved population in the victim services community. She founded the Food Safety Victims Network in 2010, which provides resources, support groups, and legal guidance for people affected by foodborne illnesses and contamination incidents. The organization has helped hundreds of families navigate the complex aftermath of food safety disasters, providing everything from medical referrals to assistance with insurance claims and legal proceedings. The case became a cautionary tale in multiple fields: food safety, research ethics, business management, criminal justice. It's studied in law schools as an example of how white-collar crime can escalate into violence. It's discussed in medical schools as a case study in toxicology and outbreak investigation. It's taught in culinary schools as a warning about the importance of supplier verification. Business schools use the case to teach about due diligence and risk management. The restaurant owners who'd purchased from Raymond became case studies in what happens when cost-cutting overrides common sense. MBA programs across the country use their stories to illustrate that the cheapest option isn't always the best option, and that failing to verify suppliers can have catastrophic consequences. The facility where Raymond conducted his experiments was demolished in 2006. The land was decontaminated and eventually sold to a developer who built a community health clinic on the site, a deliberate choice by the city to replace the location of death with a place of healing. The clinic, which opened in 2008, provides free and low-cost medical care to Portland's underserved communities, with a special focus on food safety education and nutrition counseling. A memorial plaque was installed at the clinic's entrance, listing the names of the 17 victims and containing the inscription, "In memory of those lost to the pursuit of profit over principle. May this place of healing stand as a reminder that human life is precious and that no innovation justifies the sacrifice of innocent people." Raymond Fletcher is currently incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon. He's maintained throughout his imprisonment that he was trying to solve a legitimate problem, sustainable food production, and that the deaths were an unintended consequence of a revolutionary idea that society wasn't ready to accept. He's never apologized to his victims' families. In a 2012 letter to a journalist working on a book about the case, Raymond wrote, "History will vindicate my research. The methods may have been flawed, the execution imperfect, but the core concept was sound. Humanity will eventually need alternative protein sources, and when they do, they'll realize I was ahead of my time." This lack of remorse continues to haunt the victims' families. Diane Martinez, whose son Brandon was the 6th victim, responded to Raymond's letter in a public statement. "He still doesn't understand that his research murdered my son. He still sees himself as a misunderstood genius rather than a criminal who poisoned people for profit. That's the scariest part. He learned nothing." Prison records show that Raymond has spent most of his incarceration in protective custody after multiple incidents with other inmates. Even in a population of convicted criminals, his crimes are considered particularly reprehensible. He spends his days writing what he calls his memoirs, a manuscript detailing his research and defending his actions, though no publisher has expressed interest in the work. The rat farm conspiracy remains one of the most bizarre and disturbing food contamination cases in American history. It serves as a reminder that the intersection of scientific knowledge, financial desperation, and moral failure can create monsters who genuinely believe they're doing good while causing catastrophic harm. For the families of Dorothy Hamilton, Brandon Martinez, William Chen, Elizabeth Morrison, Robert Gonzalez, Sandra Williams, Michael Thompson, Lisa Anderson, James Rodriguez, Patricia Lee, Daniel Foster, Jennifer Kim, Thomas Nguyen, Michelle Turner, Christopher Hayes, Amanda Foster, and Carlos Ramirez, the 17 people who died from Raymond Fletcher's innovation, the case will never truly be closed. They live with the absence of their loved ones every day, a permanent reminder of what happens when someone decides that their vision is more important than human life. In their memory, we remember not just their deaths, but their lives, the people they were, the futures they should have had, and the families who will never stop missing them. We honor them by demanding better from our food safety systems, our scientific institutions, and ourselves. We refuse to let their deaths be meaningless by working to ensure that nothing like the rat farm conspiracy ever happens again. And we remind ourselves that progress without ethics isn't progress at all. It's just destruction dressed up in the language of innovation. The 17 lives lost in this case stand as testimony to that truth, and their memory demands that we never forget it.